Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Isen, for giving me the opportunity to talk to you today. It's a strange feeling giving a speech without seeing the audience, but you can see me, and that's what matters. My name is Miriam Álvarez de la Rosa. I'm the Deputy Director for International Security Issues at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. And today I am going to talk about a more integrated European Union, the relation between the European defense with NATO. To do that, I will start with a definition. I will tell you what the common security and defense policy is. I will then tell you a little bit about the story of the CSDP, the Common Security and Defense Policy, how we have built a common security and defense policy throughout the last 70 years. Then I will briefly go through the institutions that implement the CSDP. In the fourth place, I will talk about the European Union Global Strategy and its implementation plan, two very important documents that shape the CSDP as we know it today. And finally, together we will try to guess the future. I know that's nearly an impossible task. I usually have my crystal ball with me, but it's run out of batteries. So we will have to figure something out. It will be an interesting exercise to put in relation CSDP with NATO and to talk about the future perspectives of this policy. So let's start in the first place with a definition. What is CSDP? CSDP is an intergovernmental policy which makes part of the common foreign and security policy of the European Union. The European Union does have a foreign policy. It's peculiar, but it is a foreign policy. And part of that foreign policy is the common security and defense policy. It's one part of the external action of the European Union. The aim of CSDP is to eventually reach a common defense of the European Union, as you can read in the slide, by increasing the military capabilities and strategic autonomy of the Union. It is not me who says that. It is the Treaty on the European Union, the Lisbon Treaty. The definition is found in Article 42.1 of the Lisbon Treaty. I will show it to you, the contents of this article, in a minute. But first, I would like you to know, because I want to make this very clear, that the two main characteristics of the CSDP is that it takes place outside the territory of the European Union, that is that the operations and missions take place outside the territory, and that the European Union depends on the capabilities provided by the European Union member states to develop the operations and missions. CSDP is a common policy, but it is a special common policy because we are not talking about agricultural common policy or fishing common policy. In this case, we are talking about a policy on a sovereign power of the state, defense. That is why it is a policy in the hands of the EU member states. It is not given to the supranational powers of the institutions of the European Union. So here you have Article 42.1. You can read the definition of CSDP. It says it will be an integral part of the common foreign and security policy, that the operations and missions take place outside the Union, with the objective of peacekeeping, conflict prevention, and strengthening international security. But it is very important that it is done in accordance with the principles of the United Nations Charter. And finally, you can see that second important trait I was talking about, that the performance of these tasks shall be undertaken using capabilities provided by the member states. So now the definition of CSDP is clear. We will have a brief look at the history of this policy. The origins of the common security and defense policy of the European Union can be found after the Second World War. The first step was maybe the Treaty of Brussels, signed in 1948 between France, UK, and the three states of the Benelux to lay the foundations of the Western European Union, an organization that had some sort of competencies in the field of security and defense. It even had a mutual defense clause. Next year, the following year, in 1947, NATO is founded by the North Atlantic Treaty. The desire to avoid future wars in Europe led the European leaders to sign the Treaty of Paris and later the Treaty of Rome, creating the European Coal and Steel Community and the European Economic Community and the European Atomic Energy Community. But if economic integration seemed fundamental and important to every member state, because everyone wanted to go in the same direction, the same did not happen with European defense. In the early decade of the 50s, last century, the idea of a common European army failed when the French Assembly vetoed the European Defense Community. We had to wait nearly until the Maastricht Treaty in 1991 to see again the idea of a common European defense policy. The Maastricht Treaty, as you may remember, organizes the European Union in a three pillars, there you are, structure. The first pillar for community affairs, the second pillar for the common foreign and security policy, and the third pillar for justice and home affairs. The one that matters for us is the second one, common foreign and security policy. CFSP, as the acronym is called, is a far more reaching policy than the one we had up to now, which was the European political cooperation that was born with the d'Avignon report in 1970 and endorsed by the European Union through the Single European Act in 1987. Because Article J4 of the Treaty on the European Union includes all questions related to the security of the Union, including the eventual framing of a common defense policy, which might in time lead to a common defense. Do you notice this typical European Community, European Union language? It says that we have a European common policy that might one day might lead to a common defense. We still haven't reached that common defense, but it's work in progress. In 1992, the Western European Union Council of Ministers, who met in the Castle of Petersburg at the outskirts of Bonn, gave birth to what we call the Petersburg Tasks. That is a series of operations and missions that take place outside the European Union territory to humanitarian and rescue operations. And the thing was that it made available military units for a range of tasks, but still the possibility of putting into practice those tasks depended on the capabilities provided by the EU member states. In 1997, the Treaty of Amsterdam helped build the decision-making process of CFSP and, more important, created the post of the High Representative for the CFSP. to be held by the Secretary General of the Council of the European Union. It also, this Treaty of Amsterdam, supported closer institutional cooperation between the European Union and the Western European Union, giving way to a decision that was later taken in 2011 to integrate the WEU in the European Union. That's why the WEU ceased to exist in 2011. Let's go now to the next step, which is even more important. It's a political declaration signed in the French coastal enclave of Saint-Malo by two very clever European political leaders, Mr. Blair from the UK and Monsieur Chirac from France. These two leaders called on the European Union to have the capacity for an autonomous action backed up by military forces and the means to use them to respond to international crises. As you can imagine, both French and British had different reasons to sign the Saint-Malo Declaration, but the fact is that this declaration is a real cornerstone on the evolution of the common defense policy of the European Union. For the British, the most important thing was to strengthen the transatlantic link, so that the EU could take more responsibility in security and defense, but taking into account the transatlantic partner. For the French, as you may know, a core objective of the French foreign and security policy has long been to create a relatively autonomous European security and defense policy that could balance the US power and complement NATO. For France, it was also important to complement the transatlantic partnership. And after Saint-Malo, a series of declarations but different European Union councils put the accent in the necessary tools to strengthen the military capability of the European Union. In this vein, we have the Cologne European Council in 1999 that called on the EU to acquire the necessary means to engage in crisis management operations. And from that council on, we have what we call the headline goal catalogue. And of course, the Santa Maria da Feira European Council during a Portuguese presidency of the Council of the European Union, when the leaders concentrated in developing the civilian crisis management capabilities in four main areas: police, strengthening the rule of law, strengthening civilian administration, and civil protection. Many people think erroneously that the CSDP is only about military operations. It is not. It is a fact that today many conflicts and crises cannot be properly managed without the civilian pillar, without civilian crisis management that complements the military operation. The Treaty of Nice in 2001, a treaty that entered into force in 2003, brought CSDP into EU institutional structure. And finally, the Lisbon Treaty, signed in 2007, is the one that gives way to CSDP as we know it today. Before it was called ESDP, European Security and Defense Policy. And the treaty includes two very important clauses we will see afterwards: the Mutual Defense Clause and the Solidarity Clause. It also allows for the creation of a European External Action Service, the EEAS, under the authority of the High Representative I was talking about before. The Treaty of Lisbon really lays the foundations of the CSDP. As you can see, many years have elapsed since 1948. It's been a long way since we have been able to talk about a CSDP. This has taken so long, basically because of the very nature of the policy we are talking about, defense, security and defense. It is a policy which falls on the sovereign powers of a state. But towards 2008, the economic crisis and a series of events that take place afterwards are going to accelerate the process of the creation of a CSDP. You may remember the miscalled Arab Springs in 2011, the rise of Daesh, or misnamed Islamic State, the threat of Russia in Ukraine, and in the Mediterranean, the series of failed states of Syria and Libya, and then the civil war in Syria that put the Schengen border system against the ropes by sending to the European Union more than 1 million refugees. Terrorism has hit the streets of France, Belgium, Germany, and in short, we can say that all this series of events erased the borders between internal and external security. Add to all this threats like energy security, cyber attacks, hybrid warfare, disinformation. These all are part of the new challenges Europe must face. None of these problems has a solution in the nation-state scheme. Common European policies are necessary, such as the CSDP. In this slide, the following slide, you will see a very quick summary of what I have told you up to now, the series of treaties, declarations, and the events that took place after 1908, finishing with Brexit in June 2016, and the arrival of Mr. Trump to the White House in November that very same year. If there was any doubt until now that the Europeans needed a common security and defense policy, at the end of 2016, it became clear. In the next slide, I have borrowed from the EU webpage. You can see the map of the current. Let me move myself here so that you can clearly see what we have. The CSDP missions and operations abroad. We have 6 ongoing military operations. Spain participates in all of them but one. We are not participating right now at EUNAVFOR Med Irini in the Mediterranean to control the embargo in Libya. And we also participate in 4 of the 11 ongoing civilian missions. Have a look at the map. It shows clearly where is the stability and security of Europe at stake. Those are the regions where Europe has to look at to keep Europe safe. So that's what I wanted to tell you about definition and history and current deployment of European operations and missions. And now let's go for the institutions. Now, as I said at the beginning, let's go very briefly through the institutions that implement CSDP. The main legal aspects of this policy are to be found in Articles 41 to 46, as well as Protocols 1, 10, and 11, and Declarations 13 and 14 of the Lisbon Treaty. The Lisbon Treaty presents CSDP as an integral part of the common foreign and security policy, and the same treaty develops the institutions that help to implement this policy, ensuring the coherence of the overall effectiveness of the European Union action. Now, let's go briefly through them. If I can change the slide, there you are. The European Parliament is body that is consulted after the Treaty of Lisbon. Its role is more relevant, and it's informed of the main aspects of the CSDP. The Parliament approves the CFSP budget, and it even has a subcommittee on security and defense. The Commission is the one in charge of the money. It administers the CFSP budget line and manages the financial instruments which contribute to crisis prevention and management. The European Council, as you know, is the meeting of the leaders at the summit, the European leaders of the European Union, and it is there where the big decisions are taken. The Foreign Affairs Council is the meeting of the foreign ministers of the EU member states, and here decisions are taken by unanimity. You should know that for the CSDP, decisions are taken by unanimity. And for military aspects, the defense ministers meet twice every 6 months in something that we call Defense Foreign Affairs Council, and informally in ad hoc meetings in the country that holds the presidency. Right now, it's Croatia, and when you listen to this talk, it will be Germany. It will start on the 1st of July. But please remember that there are no formal meetings of defense ministers because of what I told you before at the beginning. We are talking about a sovereign power, defense, which has not been given to the hands of the supranational institutions of the European Union. The High Representative of the Union is elected by the European Council, and you might remember that the first holder of this position was Mrs. Catherine Ashton, a British national and former Trade Commissioner. Then came the Italian Mrs. Mogherini, and since last November, it is the former Spanish MFA, Mr. Borrell, in office. The High Representative represents the Union for matters relating to foreign policy. And for example, in this vein, it conducts political dialogue with third parties of the Union on the Union's behalf, and expresses the Union's position in international organizations and conferences. It is the High Representative who chairs the Foreign Affairs Council. The High Representative is assisted by something that we call the European External Action Service. It is a sui generis structure distinct from the Commission and the Council's Secretariat, and it's integrated by officials of the European Union, but also the diplomatic services of the member states. The Lisbon Treaty also formalized the creation of the European Defence Agency that existed since 2004, and it's an agency that has the mandate of harmonizing defense spending, supporting defense research, and assisting member states to meet the capability commitments. Then the Political and Security Committee is a permanent body that gathers in Brussels, formed by the ambassadors of every European Union member states, and it is at the PSC where we keep track of international situation, where we help define the EU policies within the CSDP, and PSC sends guidance to and receives advice from the European Military Committee. You can see also here in the slide, which is nothing different from the Chief of Defense Staff of the member states in Brussels, represented by the military representatives of every member state. It is the highest military body of the Council. Finally, this look at the institutions would not be complete if I didn't talk about those two very important clauses that the Treaty of Lisbon puts into place. It's Article 42.7, the Mutual Defense Clause, and Article 222 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union. As you can read on the slide, the Mutual Assistance Clause states that if a member state is the victim of an armed aggression on its territory, the other member states shall have towards it an obligation of aid and assistance by all the means in their power, What does this mean? This means that the assistance does not need to be military necessarily. And as you keep on reading, you will see that it needs to abide by the Charter of the United Nations, but also it needs to respect the compromises of the member states that are also NATO allies. You may remember that France asked for mutual assistance after the terrible November 15 terrorist attacks in its territory. Finally, the solidarity clause. This has not exactly a close relation with CSDP, but might be used for the CSDP. It was introduced in the context of the terrorist attack in Madrid in March 2004. It states that the Union and its member states shall act jointly in a spirit of solidarity if a member state is the object of a terrorist attack or the victim of a natural or man-made disaster. This clause doesn't imply military assistance either. And finally, I would like to remember you that the unanimity rule prevails in the CSDP decision-making progress. With this, we have finished with the institutions part, and we go to the EUGS and its implementation plan. Let's talk now about the European Union Global Strategy and its implementation plan. I move myself so that you can see this slide. This is a document that was presented in June 2016 by the High Representative, Mrs. Mogherini, and it's a document that lays the foundation for developing the CSDP even more. Its title is Shared Vision, Common Action, A Stronger Europe. It is a document that I recommend you read. It's not very long, it's well written, it's well structured, and it's very clear, contrary to what usually the EU papers are. I don't want to be mean, but that's the way it is. The EUGS defines what we call the level of ambition, that is to say, what the unions want to do internationally as a global actor. The strategy is not binding. It does not establish an order of priorities, and in fact, it overlaps with national strategies, but still it is very important for implementing the CSDP. Think for a minute that the EU member states are very different in history, size, capacity, risk perception, and interests. In the European Union, you find one nuclear power, which has a permanent seat in the UN Security Council, together with other states that gained independence only last century, and even other smaller member states, twice the size of Cartagena in Murcia, for instance. So such diversity has to affect the ability to make decisions and act internationally. And those perceptions of interests and risks are simply impossible to compare, mostly because most of the time European Union member states think in terms of national policies, not in terms of European policies. The strategy, as I said, it's not long, it's well structured, and it sets three major strategic objectives that you can see there on the slide. I will go through them because I think that's important. First of all, the European Union needs to be able to respond to external crises. Since 2003, the European Union has participated in over 30 civilian and military missions in 4 continents. These are the operations and missions of CSDP, and they reflect the spirit of the European defense, because our security starts very far from our borders, and thus managing conflicts that sometimes happen thousands of kilometers away is usually the best way to protect ourselves. But participating or organizing those operations and missions is not free. It costs money and it needs political will. Sometimes the political will of the EU member states is not aligned. And the main problem for these operations and missions is usually what in military terms we call the force generation. The ability or the willingness of each member state to provide the European Union with means, with human resources and military capabilities and civilian capabilities. The second major strategic objective, as you can see, is helping our neighbors to be more resilient. In other words, the European Union needs to avoid failed states around us and needs to work together with the governments of our eastern and southern partners to make them more resilient. In this way, the European Union helps to reform and strengthen the security and defense sectors of these countries to provide them with capabilities. Because it does not matter what we do to help if we don't create in the first place a safe environment. Security comes first. Finally, the European Union needs to be able to protect the Union and its citizens. We have built a European Union that has given social welfare. We all know that, we can feel that, we can see that. Now it is time to provide our citizens with security, because no country on our continent, not even the largest or the more powerful, can face the security challenges of the new strategic environment alone. These three strategic objectives are developed in the EUGS implementation plan. Let me see if I can change the slide and go to the following one. There we are. So the EUGS is developed in the implementation plan on security and defense presented in November 2016. The EUGS implementation plan sets a series of measures to develop the strategy. And I'm going to summarize those measures as follows. First of all, the permanent structured cooperation. You can see in this slide, if I move myself a little bit, that I have written the official name as it is, Permanent Structured Cooperation, PESCO, and in italics, besides, a simple word, which is what it really means. PESCO means compromise. What means PESCO? PESCO is a series of projects that are being funded by the Commission to further develop the European defense. Because I'll tell you something, contrary to the popular belief, the European Union defense spending is not small. It's relatively high, in fact. And the challenge with PESCO is not to spend more, is to spend better. PESCO is enhanced cooperation. You have another example of enhanced cooperation in the European Union. You have exactly two other examples. One is Schengen, the Schengen system, and the other one is the euro. Those are examples of enhanced cooperations by a group of states who have the capacity to advance, to go further in an area. In the case of PESCO, is the area of defense. PESCO is an instrument of CSDP, which is part of CFSP, of the Common Foreign and Security Policy. PESCO is not the establishment of common defense. Not yet. We haven't reached that point yet. PESCO is a crucial step towards strengthening the common defense policy. What does PESCO imply? I was telling you before that it's projects. Since 1918, when PESCO was established by a decision of the European Council, 47 projects have been approved. They are very technical, and these are projects in the field of defense. I will give you some examples: a European drone, a helicopter, a platform to share information about cyber attacks, and so on. Spain participates in more than a dozen and leads one of them, one which is about building a command and control system for CSDP operations and missions. Keep in mind one very important thing finally. The military capabilities developed through PESCO are kept in the hands of each and every member state, so that this member state can offer the capability to either the UN, NATO, or the European Union. These are capabilities that belong to the European Union member states. Then we have another measure which is called the Capability Development Plan, CDP. What does it mean? This means priorities. The CDP provides the European Union with a vision of future needs, taking into account the needs for future security challenges, technological development, and other trends. The European Defence Agency, one of the institutions I mentioned before, helps the member states in their national defence plans so that they are coherent with the needs of the European Union. Thirdly, an even more difficult acronym to understand, which says Coordinated Annual Review on Defence, CARD. What does CARD mean? CARD means cooperation. It is like a mapping that will allow a clear overview of the EU level of spending, national investment, and defence research effort. CARD will help increase the transparency and political visibility of European defence capability so that we will be able to identify shortcomings and intensify defence cooperation and, in a word, to plan defence spending more coherently. Alongside these three measures, that means compromise, priorities, and cooperation, we need funds. We need a financial incentive, because otherwise the member states don't have the capacity to go ahead. That's why the Commission set into place new financial tools. You can see the acronyms on the screen, and these are the European Defence Action Plan, the EDAP, which was presented in November 2016, and it's going to help developing defense projects. With the EDAP, we find the European Defense Industrial Development Plan and another financial instrument, which is called the European Defense Fund, with something like 5.5 billion euros per year. It's aimed to complement the funds of the member states. It serves to coordinate and expand national investment as long as these investments comply by a series of requisites. Because you see, with over 250 billion earmarked for defense, the EU member states are second worldwide in military spending after the US. But those national defense budgets are often used in a non-efficient way due to the fragmentation of the European defense market, or due to costly duplication of military capabilities and, in a word, insufficient industrial collaboration that leads to lack of interoperability. And that is why the EU has set those measures and the new financial tools to help to overcome these limitations. With these explanations, we have I still have one other fund to talk to you about, although it has not been approved yet. It's the last acronym you see on the screen, the EPF, European Peace Facility. It's being finalized. It intends to replace the current EU operations and missions financial framework into a single one, and it will be an extra budgetary fund. That is to say, it will not be money from the European Union budget, and it is being still negotiated, but it will be a fund that will summarize another series of instruments that exist nowadays, like the African Peace Facility or the Athena mechanism that financials the operations and missions of the European Union. Now, with this, I have finished the part of the EUGS and its implementation plan, and let's go for the relations between NATO and European Union and the future perspectives. I am going to conclude this talk by telling you where the CSDP is in relation to NATO, what is the position of Spain, and trying to outline the future prospects. Now, let's take into account some figures, as you can see in the slide. 21 EU member states are also NATO allies. They were 22 before Brexit. 60% of NATO residents are citizens of non-EU countries. 80% of NATO military spending comes from non-EU allies. These figures should show the need for the EU to understand and to have a close cooperation with NATO. The truth is that both organizations have a long history of cooperation. We can go something like 15 years back, but let's not go so far, and let's concentrate on the Warsaw Summit, NATO Warsaw Summit in 2016, because it was the moment where a first joint declaration was signed, and it constitutes a shared vision on how both organizations will act together to face common security challenges. I would also recommend you to read this first joint declaration, because it's quite clear, and it's really a turning point in the history of cooperation between the two organizations. After this first joint declaration, there has been 3 more, and these joint declarations have helped to develop the 7 strategic areas that the leaders of the organizations saw as the main areas for cooperation. You can see them in the slide: cybersecurity, hybrid threats, operational cooperation, including maritime issues, defense capabilities, industry and research, coordinated exercises, and capacity building. From these 7 strategic areas, the two organizations have set a series of 74 proposals for the implementation of the strategic areas. I'm not going to go through the 74 measures, it's too long, but I can highlight the following elements: political dialogue that has further intensified at all levels, the top level, which is between the leaders of the two organizations, but also by the means of staff-to-staff talks. I should say that during the last months of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, we have used the virtual formats, and for the very first time in history, NATO ministerial meetings have taken place virtually by a secure means of video conferences. Then we also have the structured dialogue on military mobility at the staff levels, which is, I would say, the most developed form of cooperation between NATO and European Union. In that area, both organizations talk about military requirements, transport infrastructure, transport of dangerous goods, customs, and cross-border movement permissions. In the area of strategic communications, the cooperation is focused in countering disinformation incidents and hostile information activities, as well as improving the capacities related to detection, analysis, and exposure to disinformation. As you know, the first half of this year has been marked by the COVID-19 crisis. The pandemic has put all EU member states and NATO allies under tremendous strain and has brought new vulnerabilities to the surface, which could have an impact on the broader security of the Euro-Atlantic area. And you should know that both NATO and the EU are working on that. Both staffs are looking at how the COVID-19 crisis could be the opportunity to further enhance their operation. But take into account that NATO and the EU are very different organizations. One of them, NATO, is a political military organization with more limited effect on the lives of their citizens. NATO is based on collective defense, Article 5 of the Treaty of Washington, whereas the EU is a much larger project with a far more tangible impact and consequences on the citizens' daily lives. What has been the position of Spain? Spain has played a leading role in developing the CSDP together with Italy, France, and Germany. We are the biggest provider of military capacities to the EU military operations, and we are supporting the efforts to deepen the CSDP. We fully support the implementation of the security and defense part of the EU global strategy. Now, let's go for the future perspectives. As you could easily see, the future evolution of the CFSP, the foreign policy of the European Union, will be subject to external factors as the future demand of the CSDP operations and missions. It will also depend on the financial and human resources that the operations and missions will have, and also the speed at which new capacities are acquired. It will also depend on relations of the European Union with third states and international organizations. The sanitary crisis of COVID-19 will undoubtedly have an impact in the form of an economic crisis, and I wish I was wrong, but that will probably have an impact on the future evolution of CSDP. The current map of operations and missions of the CSDP I showed to you before reveals very well where the risks and threats are for the European Union. The CSDP should be ready in the future to guarantee, for instance, the distribution of humanitarian aid, to guarantee safe and stable environments to the populations, to prevent the complete destruction of the state, and of course, to train the security forces of those neighboring or partner countries so that they can progressively assume their own security in a sense of ownership. What does Brexit entail? You may know that the UK was not very much fond of the CSDP, and it's logical that the UK leaders were more looking to the transatlantic link than to a real European defense. And also, the UK was not precisely one of the biggest providers of capabilities for the operations and missions of CSDP. But still, the UK is a nuclear power, is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and it will always be a strategic partner of the CSDP, of the European Union. Brexit will have an impact and the UK will no longer participate in the decision-making process of CSDP, but still its relationship with the European Union will always be very close. What should be the objectives of the future CSDP? Let's think in a very graphic way. Let's put this very simple. What do we want from CSDP in the future? We want CSDP to maintain and protect the lifestyle of the EU citizens in the first place. We want CSDP to maintain security in the southern and eastern neighborhoods of the EU, because if those countries are not safe and stable, the EU will have a problem. And then we want CSDP to contribute to keeping open the maritime communications routes between Suez and Shanghai, because commercial relations are very much at stake. And finally, CSDP should be able to complement United Nations peacekeeping operations. In order for CSDP to cope with these tasks, I have put so simply, it will have to be able to overcome external factors, as I said before, like future demand for CSDP operations, level of financial or human resources available, relations with third states and other organizations, etc. What will be the greatest difficulty? Probably the fact that the member states do not have a common vision of the strategic environment and risks. The fact that each country has its own perception of the threats is legitimate, it's logical, it's obvious. But at the same time, each member state should be aware that the threats cannot be properly managed within a solely national framework. As I said before, that the European Union is like a universe very particular where countries have completely different histories and perceptions of their role in the international community. Nevertheless, overall, we are managing to build a European defense that will benefit we all. I don't know if that European defense will ever lead to a common defense of the European Union. I don't know if we will ever see a single European army. That's very difficult. I leave the question there for you to answer. Will we ever see a real single European army? I don't know. But I know one thing, that given the volatile nature of policy in general, of politics, I should say, it is likely that the future evolution of CFSP and CSDP will not be linear. There will be ups and downs marked by events, both national and international, that will affect the Union itself. But there is no alternative. We are moving towards a more integrated European defense, and there's no doubt about it. This concludes my intervention. I hope I have convinced you that we are moving towards a more integrated European Union defense that is compatible with NATO. Thank you very much for your attention.